All right. Welcome everyone to the Economic Journal lecture. I'm Franck Portier, one of the managing editor of the Economic Journal. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Valérie Ramy. So Valérie is Distinguished Professor of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. Valérie has contributed to, almost all the important debates in macroeconomics over the past 30 years. To name a few, what's the size of the government spending multiplier? What is the role of inventories in economic fluctuations? How did Americans use their time over the 20th century? How important the automobile industry is or was for the US economy, et cetera, et cetera. Today's lecture we'll discuss the link between micro estimates and macro models. I'm super excited and impatient to listen to Valérie. The best way to make it happen is for me just to shut up and without further ado, please welcome Valérie Ramy.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and participating in the joint RES-SES conference, and particularly in the city of the birthplace of modern economics. Also, I was very happy when Nick Crafts asked me to give this talk, because I don't know if you know, Nick Crafts actually had an important impact on my career. He was teaching European economic history my first quarter at Stanford, and his class was so engaging that my husband and I spent as much time on his class as we did all of our other classes combined. And he convinced me of the importance of economic history and how every economist needs to know some economic history. So I think that that's enriched my research. So the topic of my talk today is based on a question I've been asking myself for over a decade when I've been looking at the fiscal literature, and that is, do they add up? And how do we make sense of micro estimates and macro estimates when we're thinking about macroeconomic questions? So as a little bit of background, let me talk first about a paper that I found very intriguing and made me do a lot of thinking, which was the Angrist-Pischke work, The Credibility Revolution in Empirical Economics, which was in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2010. And they talked about all of the wonderful revolution in applied micro techniques, and they chastised macroeconomists and industrial organization economists for being slow to adopt these techniques. So they said macroeconomics economists were slow. Now, at that time, they were right. The dominant macroeconomic method was either time series, which had been around for quite a while, or quantitative dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. However, there were a few macroeconomists who were using methods that were similar to the applied micro methods, such as natural experiments. And for example, Robert Barrow and Robert Hall, and then I later used wars as natural experiments, but also timing of social security checks other people used. Now, when I wrote my Renaissance and fiscal research paper in the 2019 Journal of Economic Perspectives, I surveyed what we had done in the years since the global financial crisis. And one of the things was that macroeconomists had woken up to the promise of all of these applied micro methods, and so they were using them to try to answer macro questions. So there were many new natural experiments to estimate the household MPCs, marginal propensity to consume, not monetary policy committee as it was yesterday. And then Bartik instruments to estimate regional fiscal multipliers and panel data. And of course, outside the fiscal research, there was also a number of ones looking at the effect of declines in house prices on consumption and things like that. However, there are two caveats I raised in my 2019 JEP paper. One of them was that, and this perhaps explains the slow take-up of applied micro methods in macro, is that if you want to answer macro questions, you can use applied micro methods to estimate a micro parameter. But if you want to answer a macro question, you need a macro model. And the reason is that, for example, suppose you have a state level panel and you estimate multipliers there. You only have relative multipliers because by including time fixed effects, which we all do, you're taking out the aggregate effects on taxes, what's going on with monetary policy. So you can't necessarily transport those as is to macro, all right? So you need a macro model. And in fact, what I said is there is no applied micro free lunch for macroeconomists. If you want to answer a macro question, you also have to do some macro. But also something I noticed in reviewing all of these estimates was that sometimes when people take a micro estimate and then use that to calibrate a macro model, you would get a different answer than when you did empirical work on aggregate data. And so I was puzzled about why, in particular, the micro estimates were giving you bigger multipliers than what we were typically getting from the aggregate data. So the theme of this talk is there's now much more micro-macro confluence in terms of the estimates, and we can use that to take that credibility revolution of Angrist and Pischke a step further, okay? In particular, I'm going to argue here that whenever we can, and we can't in every situation, we should use macro counterfactuals that are implied by micro estimates to assess the plausibility of micro estimates and macro models. So why is this tool useful? Well, first of all, as I told you, micro estimates and macro aggregates don't always agree. So when I'm going into one of my panel of economic advisor meetings at the Congressional Budget Office and they say, what estimate should we use? You know, I say, well, here's the micro, here's the macro, take your pick. This tool also helps determine perhaps which estimates and which models maybe need a little bit more scrutiny. So they help direct research. And then, as I hope to illustrate today, the search for reconciliation between these estimates is often illuminating, both about the estimates and about the models. So let me give you a starting motivation for one of these tensions between micro and macro, and that is for the 2008 US rebates, okay? So soon after the rebates were given out, Marty Feldstein and John Taylor did some simple analysis of the macro data. One part of the analysis was simply a graph of the aggregate macro data. So the green line is disposable income, and that sharp spike there in the spring and summer of 2008 shows you how big the rebate was relative to the aggregate. And the blue dashed line is consumption. So you can just do your ocular econometrics. There's a big movement in disposable income, and you don't see a big spike in consumption. They concluded that the marginal propensity to consume, the MPC, from that rebate was low. However, around about 2011, Jonathan Parker and his co-authors produced new micro MPC estimates. They added rebate questions to a government survey, the Consumer Expenditure Survey, CEX for short, as well as a private Nielsen household data survey. So they asked people when they received the rebate and how much they got. It was a great natural experiment. They were using state-of-the-art applied micro methods. They estimated very high MPCs, depending on the specification and whether they allowed for lagged effects, between 0.5 and 0.9 of total consumption. And a big part of the spending was actually on motor vehicles. All right. So policymakers and researchers believe the micro estimates, right? Applied micro, the identification is so much better. This was a perfect randomized experiment, and they just ignored the simple macro analysis. Well, what are the aggregate implications of the Parker et al. Estimates if we do a simple calculation and don't worry about general equilibrium? So let me show you this graph, all right? This is based on a calculation that Sam Shapiro-Slemrod did in the very back in table 14 of a paper. Nobody knew it was there. I only knew because Matthew Shapiro told me about it, where they said, what if we take the Parker et al. Estimates and multiply that by the path of the rebate and figure out what induced expenditures were on motor vehicles. So they just looked at the motor vehicle one, and they said, that sure seems big, but nobody paid attention. So then what I had done actually in an earlier discussion is I said, oh, let's create a counterfactual and let's subtract that induced spending from the actual spending and see what it says would have happened in the summer of 2008 had there been no rebate. So the black line is actual data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, and the purple line is the implied counterfactual from Parker et al. It implies that expenditures on motor vehicles would have dropped 87% had there been no rebate. So I've studied the automobile industry for many years. No such thing has ever happened. Nothing near this has happened. And in fact, if the trough of the Great Recession in the US in June 2009, expenditures were much higher than this, all right? So there's some implausibility there, all right? So stepping back and thinking about using this kind of idea in general, what are the key ingredients for macro counterfactual plausibility analysis? First, you need micro or sub-regional estimates of key parameters that are relevant for macro effects. So these could be MPCs, state, province, city multipliers. Second, this is important, you need a policy or event that is big enough to be visible in the aggregate data. All right. Now, you could also apply this, I think, to industry data. So I'm talking macro, but I think you could also do this with industrial organization industry estimates as well. Third, for the case for macro, you need a macro model that translates the micro or sub-regional estimates to dynamic general equilibrium effects. And then you need a narrative analysis of the time period surrounding the policy or event to assess whether the macro counterfactual is plausible, all right? And that's a very important part. And it's because of that fourth part, usually when I travel to a country to give a talk, I try to do something that is from data from that country. But the examples I'm going to give are all going to be from the US because I know those data well, and I didn't want to come here and tell you something about an event in the UK where you would all say, no, I don't think so. So this is where division of labor is good. I'm going to give you some illustrations from the US, and I hope that all of you can find this useful to apply to UK experience. So I'm going to illustrate this with looking at the macro implications of micro MPC estimates. So I'm going to look both at the 2001 rebate first and the 2008. And the reason is that the reconciliation is different in each case, and I think we learn a lot from it. And then, time permitting, I'm also going to look at macro implications of some of the state-level multiplier estimates from the Obama stimulus. Okay, so just as background for all of the micro MPC estimates illustrations. So initially, Johnson, Parker, and Soulelis, JPS for short, studied the 2001 tax rebate. Parker, Soulelis, Johnson, and McClellan, PSJM for short, and Broda and Parker studied the 2008 tax rebate. Now, each study, as I said, relied on a natural experiment and then novel data creation. So they looked at, it turns out that the tax rebates were distributed to households over several months based on the last two digits of your social security number, a US number that's very important. But it turns out those last two digits don't mean anything. They're not correlated with anything about you. So it's basically randomized. And then the authors added the special questions to the consumer expenditure survey, and then Broda and Parker did it to the Nielsen data to measure the time, amount, and form of the rebate for each household. So the estimation framework was similar. It's one that's been used previously by Soulelis and Parker, and it was set up to test the life cycle permanent income hypothesis, but it was put to even more use in this case because they were talking about MPCs. So basically, in these household data, they look at the change in consumption for the household. They have controls for each month of the sample. They also have additional household controls by age, things like that. And then they have a rebate variable. They have several different specifications. So this rebate variable might be the dollar amount. It might just be an indicator of whether you received it that month, or it might be the dollar amount instrumented with the indicator. So that's the basic equation that they're estimating. All right. A few details of the 2001 rebate, go back over 2 decades. It was part of President Bush's 10-year tax cuts. They were passed in early June 2001. The tax rebates, the checks were usually either $300 or $600, depending on if it was married, if it was a couple, they got $600 typically. It was mailed to 92 million households. It phased out at higher levels, I think, that one. The total rebates were about $38 billion, which was about 6% of monthly disposable income. So they were sizable. And you can see here, this is, the rebate is in blue. I should have used a different color, I realize, because I'd use that for consumption. But you can see the time pattern in 2001, and then the green shows you disposable income. And again, you see that big spike there. Okay? Now, Parker and co-authors, when they're looking at the 2001 rebate, they construct what they call non-durable spending category, but that's more in economic parlance. It's actually a mix relative to the official government data of what the government calls non-durable goods and services. And then this particular category also had some durable goods, but it excluded other non-durable, so it was kind of a mix over the usual categories. Their instrumental variables estimates produce an MPC of 0.375, estimated decently precisely, and that was based on the quarter-to-quarter difference in spending because of the timing of the interviews. Okay. Now, their preliminary analysis finds a statistically insignificant marginal propensity to consume on total consumption that is less than the marginal propensity to consume on their non-durable subcategory, but they attribute that anomaly to noise induced by durable expenditures, and thus they ignore durables and total consumption in the 2001 study. So how do we create a counterfactual? First, we do the simple kind of thing that I showed you from the first example. So there's no general equilibrium effects. We simply calculate induced spending using that MPC of 0.375 and taking that time path of the rebates. Because people report sort of the average over the last 3 months, or they report the total over the last 3 months, but people don't believe their monthly stuff so much. We're just going to assume it's spread evenly over 3 months. This is actually creates less of a V shape than if we had used the assumptions that Sam, Shapiro, and Slemrod had used. So induced spending is just the average of, for the aggregate, is the average of those rebates over the 3 months with the MPC. The counterfactual, then, is we take actual aggregate non-durable consumption where we've taken out the BEA, Bureau of Economic Analysis categories to match what Parker and his co-authors used and subtract induced spending. Okay, when we do that, we get another V shape. It's not quite as dramatic as the motor vehicle one, but using their definition, using their marginal propensity to consume, this counterfactual is suggesting that in the summer of 2001, consumption would have plunged and then come back up again. Now, notice that low point, that is 9/11, all right? So a few comments on this, on plausibility, all right? When we look at the whole narrative, we argued that this counterfactual is implausible. Now, we expected some spending dip, and in fact, you see it in the raw data because of 9/11, but the overall path is not congruent with events. The only other 3-month periods where you saw spending go down by that grade of percent were either COVID or the 1980 credit crunch when Paul Volcker was also raising interest rates, which was a dramatic, I mean, the economy started just falling off a cliff in the US because of that. And 2001 time was considered a pretty mild recession. But this counterfactual doesn't allow for general equilibrium effects, all right? So something else could be going on. So that's why we go to the next step, which is the methodology for creating general equilibrium counterfactuals. Now, your model is going to depend on your situation. In this case, the most natural thing is just to take a standard medium scale New Keynesian model with 2 agents. So it's called a tank model. And we want two agents because if you don't have heterogeneity of agents, there'll be no effect of any kind of stimulus checks because everybody will just be the same. So this model, because it's medium scale, it's similar to the ones used by central banks. It has sticky wages, sticky prices, variable utilization of capital, which gives you more elastic supply overall, investment adjustment costs. We calibrate the fraction of households who are hand-to-mouth, the other ones are permanent income consumers, to match the micro MPC. So it's very easy to sort of slide that scale to match any micro MPC we want. We simulate the response of consumption of rebates in our model. So we see the percent deviation of consumption relative to the steady state in our model. And then we simply subtract that percent from the actual data to derive the counterfactual path with no rebate. Okay. So what do we get? Well, the purple line is the one without the general equilibrium effects. The green line is the one with the general equilibrium effects. Well, anybody who's worked with new Keynesian models know that they are rigged to amplify, all right? So it should be no surprise that we get an even worse, more implausible counterfactual because there's an amplification effect from general equilibrium. And we have things in here like monetary policy that is not too accommodative, but even with that, we find this effect. So a few comments on this. First of all, we found it useful to define a new term, which is what we call a GE MPC, or a general equilibrium MPC. And that is the change in consumption in general equilibrium divided by that rebate. So that allows that extra amplification effect. So the GE MPC will be equal to the micro MPC plus any amplification that you get from general equilibrium. Now, the GE MPC will be approximately equal to the multiplier for GDP if you have a closed economy, which our model is, and if it's a temporary stimulus. It also helps because firms are not going to suddenly invest if you just have a stimulus coming out for a few months. In addition, the fact that we have investment adjustment costs also tamps that down. So for given government spending, nothing going on with net exports, the change in output is approximately equal to the change in consumption. Now, there's also a nonlinearity in there. So I used a micro MPC estimate of 0.75 here. It's rounded to 0.38. That gives us a general equilibrium MPC of 50%. All right, so that's the amplification. Now, if we instead use the Parker et al.'s estimate where they allow for lagged effects of the rebate, you can actually get a micro MPC for their estimates of 0.66. Well, that really gets amplified in general equilibrium because just as the simple Keynesian multiplier is nonlinear, 1 over 1 minus MPC, it's also the case in a tank model. So, how to reconcile micro and macro? So, reconciliation requires either smaller micro MPCs or some kind of general equilibrium dampening, or both, all right? So we know where to look to try to figure out, how to reconcile these. So one of the things we do is re-examine the micro MPC estimates based on the consumer expenditure data. And then we consider possible modifications to the tank model. It's actually very easy to just recalibrate the model to dampen things down. You can make monetary policy less accommodative, or you could make supply less elastic. That is, you don't allow variable utilization of capital, you have less sticky prices. As you'll see, we don't even need to get to that step in this particular illustration. In the 2008 illustration, we will. So I'm only going to talk about re-examining the micro MPCs. Okay, so remember I told you they had this category. It was based on some stuff that Anna Maria Lusardi had done before, of really trying to get things that are not durable, but they had made some other choices. So as I said, it's sort of a mix of some non-durables, some services, and even a few durables in there. But it's only 61% of Bureau of Economic Analysis non-durables plus services. So let's compare what MPC estimate you get using their categories versus the usual categories. So that's what I do here. Now this is we replicated their results, we were able to do it. We made a few changes. For example, we didn't want to have households that actually receive 2 rebates because it leads to issues with what the counterfactual, well, with what the control group is. So that's why our estimate here on their non-durables category is 0.32 rather than 0.375, but we were able to replicate what they did. So there's a strict non-durables category that they look at, food and things like that, and then when they add apparel and items such as those, that's the non-durables category. Now, if we go to the BEA definitions and use those ways to group these and go back to the consumer expenditure survey, and we look at non-durables and we look at services, we're getting zeros, MPCs of zeros, all right? They're pretty precise, particularly for non-durables, and not too imprecise for services, and the magnitudes are 0. So just changing the categories to more standard ones, suddenly we're getting an MPC of 0. So those estimates that a lot of people, I think trillions were spent based on those estimates, are not robust to different categorizations. When we looked at many of the categories they omitted, they had negative MPCs, usually not significant, but they were worried. They talk about this. There's a lot of noise in the data, and that's why they excluded them. But you have to be careful about excluding, because if you look at total consumption, the MPC is also 0. Now, something else we figured out, so this is where it's useful to dig deeper when you see this implausibility result, is the 2001 tax rebates weren't a temporary stimulus. Those rebates were an initial payment on a 10-year tax cut. This was the Bush tax cut. Now, suppose that everybody was a permanent income household, but they weren't Ricardian. That is, they didn't take into account the government budget constraint. How should they behave? Well, if you look at the annuity value of a 10-year tax cut, they should have should have had an MPC of about 1/3, all right? If they're Ricardian, then it should be near 0, but we know all kinds of things that can throw Ricardian equivalents off track. So our conclusion is that, the experiment, because it's not temporary, and the micro estimates are imprecise, don't have enough information to shed light on models. So that's why we didn't even go to the model step. So what lessons do we learn? Well, the headline estimates give us implausible macro counterfactuals. Factoring in general equilibrium forces just makes the problem worse. The BEA categories are giving much lower MPCs. They look like 0. And re-examining the natural experiment reveals it's not a temporary stimulus experiment, all right? So we feel like we learned a lot by seeing this implausibility macro counterfactual and therefore digging deeper in the data. So now let's go to the 2008 rebate. That was the one that I talked about at the beginning. These rebates were even bigger. It was $100 billion. It was 11% of monthly disposable income. For those receiving the rebate, the average rebate was $1,000, because they also gave it for dependents, and it was much more generous. The rebate was passed in February 2008 and distributed May through August 2008. These rebates were temporary. There was no tax cut associated. And the following that I'm going to show is based on the paper that's on my website with Jacob Orchard and Johannes Wieland, Micro MPCs and Macro Counterfactuals, the case of the 2008 rebates. You can see I've been watching way too many, I watch a lot of British murder mysteries, so, it's the case of the 2008 rebate that we're doing. All right, so the Parker et al. 2008 estimates. So they estimate very high MPCs, and they look at total consumption as well as subcategories. Those MPCs are 0.5 to 0.9. As I said, the majority of the spending is on motor vehicles. And when you do that counterfactual, the way using the induced spending from Sam Shapiro and Slemrod, where a lot of the spending is bunched in only 2 months, you get that dramatic downward spike in the summer of 2008, and then the recovery when Lehman Brothers fails. So The next step is the GE counterfactual analysis, but this one needs to be more complicated, all right? We construct a new kind of model, which is a two-good, two-agent New Keynesian model, or a TG tank model, we call it for short, to compute the general equilibrium counterfactual. So what are the two goods? Non-durables and durables. And it turns out that this generalization is really important for understanding this episode and for the reconciliation. The durable good is interpreted as motor vehicles. And using this, and I'll show you a few graphs, we argue that the high micro MPCs imply implausible macro counterfactuals. We offer detailed narrative analysis and forecasts of 2008. And we show that there's just no way, nobody was forecasting. There is nothing in the data that suggests there should have been a V shape in the summer 2008 that recovered most of the way when Lehman Brothers fails. Few details on the calibration of the model. So we match the micro estimates for durable demand elasticity. Now, why are durables so different from non-durables? Several reasons, but what's particularly important here is that the elasticity with respect to the price for a durable is much higher than for a non-durable because you can intertemporally, you're much more willing to intertemporally substitute your expenditures on durables. Okay? We set the fraction of hand-to-mouth households to match the Parker et al. At 2 points of the range. In our baseline model, we're going to assume the relative supply of durables in terms of non-durables is infinitely elastic. That's doing things like a one-good model where we say that they're perfect substitutes in production. You'll see that we're going to have to change that assumption in order to do the reconciliation. And then we match the size and timing of the actual rebate. So when we do the general equilibrium counterfactual, so the black line is the data, the orange line is using a total consumption MPC of 0.5 from Parker et al. And then also 0.86. It looks even worse. The counterfactuals have pronounced V shapes. And if you compare that to other declines in consumption, only COVID and the 1980 credit controls period have bigger drops in consumption. Okay. How do we reconcile them? Well, first we re-examined the micro MPC estimates in light of the new econometrics of diff and diff estimators. Now, when Parker and al. Were doing these estimates, they were using the state of the art, and we all thought we could use OLS to estimate a diff and diff one. Well, now we've been enlightened by all of the new econometrics, and so we can't do that because there are all kinds of problems I don't have time to get into. We actually identify 3 biases. One that's related to that recent econometrics, but there are 2 other ones we do. When we correct for those biases, the MPC estimates fall by 40% or more. So again, the estimates we're finding are biased upwards by something in the specification, and they're actually lower. And the MPC on durables we find is that non-durables is actually 0, but most of that total consumption MPC is for durables. And it makes sense. You get a rebate check, you say, oh, this is great. I have more as a down payment on a car. And so then you say, that means I have to take out less for a loan. I'm going to buy a car. And they're obviously not consuming it all now. They're buying a durable that's going to give them a flow of consumption. We modify the macro model to allow for general and partial equilibrium dampening. What do we do here? We simply change that supply elasticity of durable goods from infinity to 5, so still pretty high. But what that does is it's going to lead to crowding out, because when all those people with their rebates go out to the dealers raise the price. You can see it in the data. That means that the people who don't have the rebates, the permanent income people, say, I'm going to wait a little while before I buy a car. The prices are high. And that's actually consistent with the data as we show. If you take our new micro MPC estimate of 0.34, and you take our model that looks like a standard New Keynesian model with all of its amplification, but you allow for heterogeneity in goods and a supply curve that's not perfectly elastic, you get something that looks much more reasonable, but it implies a GE MPC less than 0.1. And remember, the GE MPC is the multiplier. So it suggests a very, very small multiplier from those rebates. So the addition of durable goods is crucial for our dampening result, as I said, because durables have more elastic demand than non-durables. The overall MPC and the distribution of spending matters. If we calibrate the MPC to 0.34 in a one-good model, we would still get implausible V-shapes because non-durables have a lower intertemporal elasticity of substitution. So individuals don't respond as much. Heterogeneity of goods is as important as heterogeneity of households. And as I said, it suggests a multiplier that's much smaller. So the third illustration, which is a short one because it's a lot simpler to do, is the state level ARRA, which is the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. I think it was the Obama stimulus in 2009, those multiplier estimates. So this is a different kind of way of looking at things. So Gabe Chaudhary-Reich's really nice 2019 synthesis of all of the people who had looked at the effect of the ARRA. When he standardized and improved the specification, he found an estimate that he estimated that there were 2 jobs created for every $100,000 federal dollars spent in the state. And it was a reasonably precise estimate. He then used, as you know, the state estimates are relative multipliers, they're not the aggregate. But then he used the theoretical insights from Farhi and Werning to argue that these state level multipliers were a lower bound on the aggregate multipliers because of the zero lower bound that was occurring in 2009. So creating the macro counterfactual. So I actually did this in a Peterson Institute discussion in 2017, and then the volume was published in 2019. I used Chaudhary-Reich's estimated impulse responses of employment that were in the appendix, and its estimates of how much of the ARRA was spent by December 2010. I created a counterfactual unemployment rate by adding the induced employment to the actual number unemployed. There are some assumptions there, but I think that they are reasonable. So here is what it looks like. The green line shows you the actual unemployment rate in the US during the global financial crisis, or Great Moderation as it's called in the US, or Great Recession as it's called in the US. The unemployment rate rose to 9.9%. If you believe that there are 2 jobs created for every 100,000 of the Obama stimulus, and use that to create the counterfactual, it suggests that the unemployment rate would have risen to 15.5%, okay, had there been no ARRA. Now, the change from the December 2008 peak, all right, because that was basically just a few months before the stimulus was passed, the change in actual unemployment was 2.7%. The change in the counterfactual unemployment was 8%. So it suggests you would have just had a dramatic increase in the unemployment rate relative to what actually happened. Now remember, I'm not taking out the effects of what the Federal Reserve did, because they did a lot of things, and the other things the Treasury did. So how do we reconcile the state estimates with the macro counterfactual? Well, in my Journal of Economic Perspectives paper, I argued that it turns out that those state estimates may not be nationally representative. All right? All the studies doing the state estimates use per capita variables, so each state is weighted equally. North Dakota was weighted equally with California. North Dakota has 700,000 people in it. California has 40 million people in it. Okay? If there's heterogeneity in the treatment, we may not be getting the average treatment effect. All right? Also, most studies don't take into account something that Leduc and Wilson found, which is there was induced state spending. If you got federal dollars, you were actually more likely to use state dollars. If I take into account those 2 things, then, and include both the weighting and the induced state spending, I get an estimate of 0.9 jobs created per 100,000. I have a higher standard error, but that's what the estimate is. What happens if you do a counterfactual for that? Well, that says that if that's the multiplier, it says that the unemployment rate would have risen to around 12.4% without the Obama stimulus, rather than 9.9%. So still a sizable effect on the unemployment rate, but perhaps a little bit more plausible. So, summary and a few conclusions. So I've argued that we can exploit this micro-macro confluence to use macro counterfactuals implied by the micro estimates to assess the plausibility of both the micro estimates but also the macro models. What might be wrong with those as well? I've illustrated this method with 3 examples. 2 of them were on rebates, but then the other one was on state level multipliers. Now, the search for reconciliation, I hope that this is illustrated, really can lead to a lot of new insights, to better ways to model the macro effects and then better ways to estimate the micro parameters. And this method can be used for natural experiments in other countries as well as for questions, and as I say, including partial equilibrium questions, such as what are the effects of something on a particular industry? You could use that industry's data to do that. So I hope this has been useful to you, and it's been a pleasure to talk.
Thanks a lot, Valerie. We have time for a few questions. Yes, please. I think that a microphone should come over here, please. Thank you.
Let me grab my water.
Sure.
Thank you for a super interesting talk. I was reflecting on kind of your findings, particularly the first paper, that in a sense in the first paper, what was wrong with it was not your macro model, right. But the fact that we've had changes in, and in fact it was your second paper, had changes in how we think about estimating micro models. Right. So, I mean, how much of gain, this is a bit unfair, but how much gain would you get by just kind of going back and doing replications on older micro studies, is your view, as opposed to actually putting the two together in the way to illustrate, you know, do you need to do what you do to aggregate it up to the macro level to find out that it might be implausible before going fishing?
Yeah, so 2 answers. So one is, if I have competing questions, you know, I can at least tell somebody those micro estimates with that macro model are giving a different answer. So that's useful, say, for policymakers. But second, there are a lot of micro estimates out there, right? Now, the more important ones, the more prominent ones do get more attention, but perhaps not as much extra attention. A lot of people, because Jonathan Parker and his co-authors do such great work, a lot of people just didn't question them. You wouldn't believe how much time we spent since December trying to figure out those consumption categories. It's a lot of work, right? We probably wouldn't have done that if we didn't have this little alert bell saying something's not adding up. And so I think it's, in that sense, it really helps us focus, because there's not enough time to go to all the studies. And I write these review articles, and I really try to delve into these various studies, but you just can't spend as much time on any of them. And so I think this is a useful way to sort of do a laser focus on a particular set of estimates, because they're not adding up. And I should say, one of the reasons we started working on this paper in 2019, the 2008 one, and one of the reasons we put it aside for several years is we couldn't figure out how to reconcile things. We tried to do behavioral models to try to explain why consumers would behave this way. And then we started seeing this new econometrics literature come out. We said, oh, I'll bet you, this is important, and then we went back to it. We said, yes, it is important, and so then that's what led us to go back and re-estimate that. So I think it is useful. We just don't. It's more the time. I also study time use. There's a time constraint, and so having some indicator of where we need to look more closely, I think, is useful.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering if there could be a couple of reasons why that could explain the divergence between micro and macro estimates. In the first paper, if I remember correctly, the estimate was an IV one. Mm-hmm. So with an IV estimate, what you typically get is a late local average treatment effect. So, which corresponds to those who respond to the instrument. So with a macro model, you are looking at the average treatment effect. So there is a definitional, I think, discrepancy between those two estimates. The second reason that could explain maybe the divergence is that whether you do IV or OLS or diff in diff or regression discontinuity, an underlying assumption is that there are no treatment spillovers. Or to put it more technically, the stable unit treatment value assumption holds, which basically means that treatment received by household A does not affect the potential outcomes of household B. Now, in the context that you are looking at, that's a very implausible assumption, because the rebate received by household A could, if household A receives a rebate, they could spend it, let's say, in the firm to buy products from the firm where household B works, and that could affect household B's consumption. Or this is a general equilibrium effect, again, showing up, but in the kind of microdata context. So these estimates in your context are likely to be problematic precisely because of the violation of the Sutva assumption. So that could be a reason why you have these discrepancies.
Okay, so two answers. The MPC is the same, we actually use the indicator variable in our main 2008 ones. If you look at Parker, they don't vary much according to whether you use OLS or IV or the indicator variable, so there's not a difference there. And it was just neater to show the IV estimates for this, but in the other case we use the indicator, it doesn't matter. They're still about the same. Second, the spillovers of one household consuming onto the possible income through the jobs of another household consuming is what we call general equilibrium New Keynesian. And that's why we do the New Keynesian model. That is the spillover we're capturing.
No, I agree, but what I'm saying is that the micro estimates might be invalid because of this problem.
No, but see, that's why you put in the month fixed effects. You're taking out the general equilibrium when you put the month-year fixed effect. Okay. Month fixed effects, I keep saying year fixed effect.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, Mary?
Yes, thank you. That was great. I really learned a lot from it, and I began to think about all this in a very different way as a result, so a wonderful talk. I wanted to explore a little bit your notion of what's implausible. And I think in the first two examples you were using various really big one-off events like COVID or the 1980 credit crunch or 9/11 or whatever. But in the final example, and I can see that these are outstanding events, so anything which they kind of create a bound for what's plausible or implausible. But in your last example, if I understood you correctly, you were looking at the unemployment rate. And you had if I got this correct, 2 jobs per 100,000 stimulus versus 1. And that gives you a very different unemployment rate. So what's the kind of sense of why one is more implausible than the other? Is it to do with something you know from other fields about this kind of how much a new job costs, if you like? Or is it something about the implausibility of that unemployment rate that you just think is out of order for any period of the US economy since the 1930s? I mean, how are you getting, you're using other information. I mean, what's the kind of implausibility key that you're using? I mean, what's the kind of, why do I think this is implausible? It's to do with that sort of example, which seems to be very different than the first two.
So that's a great example. That's a great question, Mary, because I had used that in a discussion that had a number of other things in it. I was just giving it as an example, but I have not done my homework on how implausible that might be and whether so you're absolutely right. I remember initially looking at like what happened during the Great Depression, but that's why that's such an important component that we've definitely done with the 2008 rebate and are doing now with the 2001, is that narrative and as when we first did this, we say there's 3 pillars. You have to have good data. You have to be able to make a convincing case that this is implausible. I did not do that for you, so you caught that right away. Why is 15.5 implausible and the other? That's more just seat of the pants. I will be upfront. All I can say is when I presented that at the Peterson Institute, and Ben Bernanke was in the audience, he looked shocked. So that was about as close as I could get to somebody who was there. But also, I know that Christina Romer, she thought that was a little high, for what would have happened without the stimulus. But you're absolutely right on, and it's a really important part. And in fact, your question really highlights something that people might not have seen is you've got to spend a lot of time on that narrative. Forecasts, you look at forecasts at the time and all those sorts of things to try to make the case.